This is Beyond the Business.
At this point, we have reached the end of the energy chain. Over the last episodes, I have walked through how energy is extracted, transformed, stored, and delivered. Step by step, process by process, and layer by layer. This final episode is not about a new technology or a new solution. It's about what the entire system produces once all these stages are combined. Because energy doesn't become cheap or clean at any single point, its cost is cumulative. Every decision made upstream in extraction, transformation, storage, and delivery doesn't disappear. It stacks, it carries forward, and it shows up later, often somewhere else, and often paid by someone who had no role in the original decision. So, this episode is about the blind spots that emerge when we look at energy in fragments instead of as a system. Not the price on a bill, not the emissions at one stage, but the final cost: economic, environmental, institutional, and social. That remains once the system finishes its work. That's what we are going to unpack here. One of the biggest misunderstandings about the fuel price today is where the cost actually comes from. When people say the fuel has become expensive, it often sounds as if the fuel itself has changed. As if oil, gas, or coal suddenly became rarer or more valuable on their own. In reality, the material did not change that much. What changed is everything built around it. 15 years ago, fuel was cheaper not because oil was magically abundant, but because the system around it was simpler. Fewer layers, fewer constraints, fewer costs pushed forward into the final price. In practical terms, this shift is visible in the numbers. In many European countries, the final retail price of fuel has increased by roughly 150 or to 300% over the past 10 to 15 years, depending on location. Not because the fuel itself tripled in value, but because additional layers were added around it: taxes, environmental charges, compliance costs, reserves, logistics buffers. Each layer looks manageable on its own. Together, they reshape the price entirely. Today, every stage of the energy chain adds its own permanent surcharge. Extraction is more expensive not because oil disappeared, but because easy fields are gone. Production moved offshore, deeper, further, and into more complex geology. More equipment, more energy input, more insurance, more regulation. All of that becomes part of the price long before the fuel reaches the refinery. Transformation adds another layer. Refineries run continuously, consume large amounts of energy themselves, and operate under increasingly strict environmental and safety rules. Taxes, emission quotas, compliance costs, and upgrades are not paid once. They are paid every day and folded directly into the cost of every liter produced. Storage adds a cost that has nothing to do with the fuel itself. We are no longer paying only for what we consume, but for constant readiness, strategic reserves, buffer capacity, idle storage, temperature control, you name it, and so on. Fuel is charged not just for being used, but for being available at all times. Delivery adds the final layer: transport across oceans, pipelines, railways, ports, terminals. Security, weather risk, geopolitical exposure, insurance, and redundancy. This is the last stage where price increases again, simply because fuel must survive the journey to the consumer. None of these costs exist in isolation. They all accumulate. That is why fuel costs more today than it did 10 or 15 years ago. Not because the molecule changed, but because the system around it became heavier, slower, and more expensive to operate. Environmental taxes, safety requirements, compliance rules, and risk buffers were introduced with good intentions. But most of them don't reduce emissions directly. They increase operating costs. Those costs do not disappear. They move forward through the chain and settle on the final buyer. In the end, consumers are not paying for fuel alone. They are paying for a complex system designed to manage risk, delay consequences, and maintain stability, often without actually solving the environmental problems. Fuel did not become expensive by accident. We built it that way. When people talk about risk in energy, they usually imagine accidents. Leaks, explosions, spills, something rare and dramatic. In reality, most modern energy failures don't look like disasters. They look like normal systems quietly losing the ability to function. The first layer of risk is operational. In 2021, the UK experienced widespread fuel shortages. Not because refineries stopped, not because oil ran out, fuel was available, infrastructure was intact. What failed was delivery, a shortage of qualified tanker drivers. The system was so tightly optimized that it had no buffer. One missing link was enough to trigger panic, price spikes, and emergency government intervention. Nothing broke, the system simply could not adapt. This is what operational fragility looks like. Energy systems increasingly depend on uninterrupted coordination between labor, logistics, scheduling, and regulation. When any one of these elements weakens, the impact travels instantly downstream. Fuel does not need to disappear for energy to stop working. The second layer is climate risk. Much of today's energy infrastructure was designed for a climate that no longer exists. In recent years, prolonged droughts across Europe reduced river levels to the point where fuel, coal, and industrial inputs could not be transported reliably. Power plants faced cooling constraints, logistics slowed, costs increased, output dropped. These were not extreme events in the traditional sense, they were gradual shifts, persistent conditions, the kind that systems struggle with precisely because they don't trigger emergency responses. Infrastructure built for historical averages now operates closer to its limits more often for longer periods. Climate risk is no longer about sudden destruction. It is about chronic misalignment between design assumption and reality. And the third layer is security. In 2021, for example, a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline in the United States shut down one of the largest fuel distribution systems in the country. No physical damage occurred, no valves exploded, no pipelines ruptured. Operation stopped because control was lost. Fuel again was available, infrastructure again existed. What failed was trust in the system's ability to operate safely. Management chose to shut it down. This is a different kind of risk altogether. Energy systems are becoming increasingly automated, digital, and interconnected. Control systems now matter as much as physical assets. A vulnerability in software can have the same effect as a mechanical failure, but at much greater speed and scale. Taken together, these risks reveal a pattern. Energy systems are not becoming more dangerous because accidents are increasing. They are becoming more fragile because complexity is increasing faster than resilience. Systems are optimized for efficiency, cost reduction, and continuous flow, but not for disruption, adaptation, or uncertainty. Risk in the context is not an outlier, it is built into the structure. The more energy systems rely on perfect coordination across labor, climate conditions, digital control, or global logistics, the less tolerant they become to deviation. Failure does not arrive as a catastrophe, it arrives as interruption, delay, shutdown, loss of confidence. And when that happens, the cost is no longer technical. It becomes economic, social, and political. If you zoom out, the energy system has a strange feature. Responsibility exists everywhere, but it's broken into pieces. At the extraction stage, responsibility sits with producers. Their job is to keep supply stable, keep costs under control, and keep the business alive. They are judged on output, reliability, margins, and compliance. If they stop, everything downstream feels it immediately. At the transformation stage, the responsibility shifts to operators and industrial infrastructure. Refineries, processing plants, terminals. Their responsibility is operational, continuity, and safety. They run under rules that are strict, expensive, and constant. If something goes wrong, it's not theoretical, it becomes a real incident, real disruption, real cost. Then responsibility moves again to regulators and governments. Their role is to keep the system functioning without breaking society. They introduce standards, taxes, quotas, reporting rules, safety baselines. And very often, they choose what is politically survivable, not what is structurally optimal. And then there is the consumer. The consumer pays but doesn't decide. You don't choose the architecture. You don't vote on which energy chain gets built. You don't negotiate refinery upgrades, storage buffers, shipping routes, or security standards. You receive the final product like a prescription. This is what the system produced. This is the price. This is the option set. You can refuse the prescription only by stepping outside the modern economy, which is not a real choice for most people. That's the core issue. Responsibility is distributed, but ownership is missing. Because when responsibility is fragmented like this, the easiest path is always the one that keeps the existing machine running. Fossil fuels remain dominant, not because they are misunderstood, but because they are the most convenient to maintain. The infrastructure is already built, the rules are already written around it, and the markets already know how to price it. The whole world is trained to keep it moving. A full shift would mean large, visible upfront decisions, new grids, new storage, new industrial layouts. That immediately looks like higher prices, new bills, new disruption. Society reacts fast to that. Businesses react fast. Politicians react fastest of all. So we end up in a paradox. We keep adding layers that make the old system more expensive. Compliance, safety, buffers, risk controls, taxes, and society pays for it anyway through higher end prices. But when the conversation turns to rebuilding the system properly, the same society is told it would be too costly and too disruptive. In other words, we keep paying for adaptation in the least efficient way by keeping the old structure alive and pricing the damage into the future, instead of paying once to change the structure itself. This is why the question of responsibility matters. Not who is guilty, but who is actually able to decide, because until responsibility comes with the real ownership of outcomes, the system will keep choosing what is economically and politically convenient, even when everyone can see that is the most expensive option in the long run. So let me ask you something. If energy keeps getting more expensive, but the resource itself hasn't really changed, what exactly are we paying for? Are we paying for fuel or are we paying for a system that became too complex to question? At every stage we talked about, the logic was reasonable. Extraction needed safeguards, transformation needed control, storage needed readiness, delivery needed protection. Each decision made sense on its own, and together they created a system that works, but only by constantly pushing cost forward. The uncomfortable part is this: no one fully owns the outcome. Companies optimize within the rules, regulators manage risk through layers and delays, Consumers inherit the final price without ever participating in the design. And so we keep using the same fuels, not because they are invisible to us, but because they are politically and economically convenient. Changing the system would be expensive, keeping it is expensive too. The difference is only when the cost becomes impossible to ignore. So the real question is not whether we can afford a different energy future. The real question is how long can we afford to delay responsibility for the one we already have?